So Andrew Parker Bowles is finally talking at 8 to 5 about the real reason his marriage to Camilla collapsed. And the most striking part isn't the details he's sharing now. It's that he stayed silent for more than 30 years while the world happily accepted a completely different story. We've all been told the divorce was essentially a quiet, mutual understanding. That Andrew was the agreeable ex-husband who politely stepped aside so his wife could be with a future king, that everything was handled with that classic British restraint and everyone simply moved on. But when you listen to what Andrew Parker Bowles is actually describing, that entire narrative collapses. This was never a gentleman gracefully making room. This was a man who slowly realized his whole marriage had been carefully managed from the start. And the people controlling the strings weren't only his wife and her lover. They were palace officials who apparently already had a system in place for exactly this kind of situation. Before we go further, if this kind of deep dive is useful to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next update on this story. Now let's look at what Andrew Parker Bowles is really saying. The detail that hits first is how he remembers meeting Camilla Shand in the late 1960s. He was 23, a cavalry officer in the Blues and Royals, with a solid military record and the kind of background that made him a serious prospect in those circles. Camilla was 20, sharp, irreverent, nothing like the polished debutantes who treated the social season as a performance. Andrew Parker Bowles says he was immediately drawn to her, not simply because she was attractive, but because she listened to his army stories with real attention, shared his passion for horses, and carried an earthy directness that sat oddly and powerfully against her aristocratic upbringing. They became a constant presence at parties and events, photographed together, finishing each other's sentences, sharing private jokes. People who knew them then said the attraction was genuine. Andrew Parker Bowles still insists that part was true. The early romance between the cavalry officer and the debutante actually happened. But even in those first years, he noticed something else. Camilla lit up around power. Her family links already placed her near royal circles, and she seemed to understand social ranking and how to move through it almost by instinct. Andrew Parker Bowles assumed it was just cleverness, social polish. He never recognized it as ambition. That difference matters, because it explains everything that followed. The timeline is important here. Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla had already been together more than 2 years when talk began that Prince Charles was interested in her. It was 1970. Charles was 22, still awkward and uncertain, not the kind of figure who looked like a threat to a decorated officer. Andrew Parker Bowles first treated the gossip as empty noise. Then he started seeing small changes. Whenever the prince's name came up, Camilla's expression sharpened with a focus he hadn't noticed before. She asked oddly precise questions about palace routine and royal etiquette. And then Andrew Parker Bowles himself helped arrange a polo match where Charles and Camilla first properly met. Looking back, that detail is almost cruel. He helped set in motion the beginning of the end of his own relationship without understanding what he was doing. What unsettled him most was watching Camilla change when Charles was present. She became livelier, more teasing, more fully present. It was as if she had been waiting for the chance to hold the attention of someone of that rank. Soon Charles seemed to appear everywhere. He was at the same parties, the same hunts, finding reasons to visit mutual friends whenever Andrew and Camilla were expected. Andrew Parker Bowles describes feeling like an outsider in his own relationship, watching a private connection form between his girlfriend and the heir to the throne, complete with shared references that left everyone else outside. When he finally asked Camilla straight out whether she had feelings for the prince, she turned the question back on him. Why was he insecure about a friendship with a man who could never marry someone like her? It was a perfect deflection. She made him feel ridiculous for asking while never actually denying the pull. That was the beginning of the pattern. Camilla's real skill was not only the affair itself. It was controlling the story around it so thoroughly that Andrew Parker Bowles started doubting his own reading of events. By 1971, the situation had hardened in ways that are still hard to take in. Andrew Parker Bowles recalled coming back from military duties to find Camilla quickly ending phone calls, her face flushed, claiming she had been talking to friends. But the pattern was clear. The calls happened at times when he was supposed to be away, and they always left her in a noticeably lighter mood for hours afterward. Then the coded language appeared. A riding lesson could mean something else entirely. A charity meeting might cover a private arrangement. Weekend trips to help friends with horses kept lining up with periods when Charles had no official duties. What hurt Andrew Parker Bowles most was not the lies themselves. It was how easily they came. He was living with someone who could look at him and invent a story without hesitation, and that discovery cut deeper than the knowledge of the affair. His military training had taught him to notice small details, and the details were becoming impossible to ignore. Absences that lasted far longer than the stated plans. New expensive pieces of jewelry Camilla said were gifts from female friends. Sudden changes in weekend arrangements that always seemed to suit someone else's diary. And then he found the letters. He was searching for insurance papers in her desk and came across them tucked under ordinary household bills. Letters in unmistakable handwriting speaking of longing, shared plans, a future that clearly did not include him. The content showed not only physical betrayal but an emotional closeness of a depth Andrew Parker Bowles realized had never existed in his own relationship with Camilla. He had been in love with someone who, it seemed, could not feel the same way about him. The breaking point arrived in 1973. It was not a dramatic scene or a tearful confession. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening. Camilla came home from what she called a shopping trip, her mood unusually bright, and sat across from Andrew Parker Bowles with her hands folded in her lap, a gesture he had learned to recognize as the start of a difficult conversation. What she said next, he says, has stayed in his mind for 50 years. She told him, with almost clinical calm, that she was in love with someone else and their relationship had reached its natural end. No raised voice, no tears, no recognition of the damage it would cause. When he asked who, she smiled faintly and said he already knew. What disturbed Andrew Parker Bowles most was not the betrayal itself, but her apparent inability to understand why he might be hurt. She spoke as if their years together had been a pleasant temporary arrangement rather than a serious commitment, something that had simply outlived its usefulness. When he asked whether there was any chance of working through the problems, her answer revealed a real calculation. She told him some opportunities were too important to sacrifice for the sake of protecting feelings, and that as a military man he should understand the need for strategic thinking even in matters of the heart. Then she set out her plan for their future with the precision of a business proposal. They would continue appearing together at social events until a suitable transition period had passed. He would keep quiet about the real reasons for the separation. In return, his social position would stay intact, and she would make sure he remained welcome in the circles that mattered for his career. She had anticipated his questions, prepared her replies, and knew exactly how to present the end of the marriage as a mutual decision. In that moment, Andrew Parker Bowles understood he had never truly known the woman he thought he loved. The person sitting opposite him was someone entirely different from the one he had believed himself in love with for nearly 5 years. And then the situation became genuinely unsettling. In the weeks after that conversation, Andrew Parker Bowles was approached through military channels by a senior courtier and invited to what was described as an informal discussion of matters of mutual interest. They met in a private dining room of a gentleman's club in St. James's, somewhere with no risk of interruption or observation. Andrew Parker Bowles assumed it was damage control, someone checking whether he would stay discreet about the prince's relationship with his girlfriend. What he met instead was something far more calculated. The courtier, whose name Andrew Parker Bowles still will not give, presented what he called a framework for handling a delicate situation. The language was careful, but the meaning was clear. Andrew's cooperation in making the transition smooth would be both expected and rewarded. The rewards were significant. Faster military advancement with assurances that his career would benefit from the gratitude of certain powerful people, suggestions of future business opportunities, hints that his financial position could be permanently improved through arrangements structured to look entirely legitimate. Andrew Parker Bowles describes his first reaction as anger. The idea that he could be bought off, that his humiliation could be compensated with promotions and money, was insulting. But as the conversation continued, he understood this was not really an offer he could decline. The courtier made it plain, without ever saying it directly, that Andrew's future depended entirely on his willingness to play the part written for him. The most chilling element was the courtier's casual mention of other people who had found themselves in similar positions over the years. There was a clear suggestion that Andrew Parker Bowles was not the first to face this choice, and that the palace had long experienced managing such awkward romantic complications involving members of the royal family. What unsettled Andrew Parker Bowles most was the realization that his relationship with Camilla had apparently been watched and managed from its earliest stages. The courtier knew intimate details that could only have come from someone very close to the situation. That raised the question of whether Camilla had been reporting on their relationship all along, whether she had been an active participant in the manipulation from the beginning. By the end of that meeting, Andrew Parker Bowles understood he had a choice between cooperation and ruin. The so-called gentleman's agreement was really a carefully constructed ultimatum dressed in the language of mutual benefit and civilized behavior. The children are where the story becomes genuinely painful. Tom and Laura Parker Bowles were teenagers when their private family crisis turned into international headlines. Andrew Parker Bowles describes watching them deal with it with a helpless anguish that is still hard to read about. Suddenly, the two of them were being photographed on the way to school, followed by reporters looking for comments, subjected to a tension that would have been heavy for adults, let alone adolescents trying to understand their parents' failed marriage. They learned to spot photographers hiding near the school gates. They developed ways of avoiding certain public places where journalists might corner them. Most painfully, they began to pull back from their father, not because they loved him less, but because being seen with him only increased immediate interest in their family's affairs. The story that took hold in the press presented Camilla as a woman trapped in a loveless marriage who had finally found real happiness with Prince Charles. Andrew Parker Bowles was cast either as a fool who had failed to notice his wife's unhappiness or as a calculating figure who had benefited from royal connections. His children, absorbing this version through newspapers and television, began to wonder whether their father had somehow driven their mother into another man's arms through his own failings. Andrew Parker Bowles could not tell them the full truth without destroying their relationship with Camilla completely. He could not explain the pressure, the calculation, the managed nature of their mother's departure. So he accepted blame for shortcomings that were not entirely his, simply to protect his children's ability to keep a relationship with their mother. Then Charles began working to win over Tom and Laura, offering experiences and opportunities that Andrew could never match, gradually and systematically taking his place as a main male influence in their lives. What Andrew Parker Bowles found hardest was watching his children's slow adaptation to the new reality. They learned to keep their affection for their father while accepting the advantages that came with their mother's royal connection. The practical way they adjusted reminded him painfully of Camilla's own ability to separate feeling from strategic gain. From his position as a discarded husband, Andrew Parker Bowles had a front-row view of one of the most striking transformations in modern British history, Camilla's journey from the most hated woman in the country to queen consort. He watched the early years after the divorce as she and Charles conducted their relationship with growing openness, appearing at the same social events, slowly normalizing their presence as a couple in circles where Andrew had once been welcomed as Camilla's husband. The social awkwardness was intense. Yet what impressed him despite everything was how efficiently Camilla moved through those situations, how skillfully she kept friendships with people close to Andrew while establishing her new position. When Charles and Diana's marriage collapsed and the affair became public knowledge, Andrew Parker Bowles watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as the woman he had once shared ordinary mornings with was debated in Parliament, condemned by church leaders, and subjected to a level of public hatred that felt almost medieval. He found himself in the strained position of feeling protective towards someone who had caused him deep pain, recognizing that whatever Camilla's faults, the fury directed at her was excessive and often rooted in misogyny. What impressed him, even against his personal feelings, was her resilience. She absorbed death threats, public humiliation, and social exclusion with a steadiness that reminded him of the qualities that had first drawn him to her. The woman who had seemed more fragile during their marriage revealed reserves of strength that surprised even someone who had known her closely. The gradual rebuilding of her public image was something Andrew Parker Bowles observed with a kind of professional respect. The careful use of charitable work, the patient cultivation of media relationships, the steady accumulation of public acceptance through consistent behavior over many years, all of it showed a level of political skill he had never fully recognized while they were married. He began to understand that Camilla possessed abilities that went far beyond social charm, that she was capable of carrying out long-term strategies with remarkable discipline. When Charles and Camilla finally married in 2005, Andrew Parker Bowles watched on television with a complicated mixture of feelings. Satisfaction at seeing her reach the goal she had pursued for more than 30 years, but also a deep sadness at recognizing how completely their shared past had been erased from the story of her success. When she became queen consort after Elizabeth's death, the emotions became even more layered. Pride and melancholy tangled together. The woman who had once been his wife had reached the highest position available to any woman in British society, yet in doing so she had become someone entirely removed from the person he had once loved. At 85, Andrew Parker Bowles is speaking now because, he says, truth matters more than diplomacy at this stage of life, and legacy becomes more important than keeping secrets. He insists his reason is not revenge or bitterness toward the woman who is now queen consort, nor an attempt to diminish her achievements or challenge her position. It is a natural wish of an elderly man to make sure his own story is recorded accurately before it becomes impossible to correct the historical record. Too many accounts of the Charles and Camilla romance have reduced him to a convenient obstacle that was easily removed on the path to true love. The reality was far more complicated and far more painful. His marriage to Camilla was not a convenience or temporary placeholder. It was a genuine relationship built on real affection and shared experiences. The betrayal was not simply discovering an affair. It was realizing that the woman he loved had been systematically deceiving him while planning his removal from her life with calculated precision. The involvement of palace officials was not gallant help from well-meaning courtiers. It was sophisticated pressure that left him with no real choice about his own future. His children were not merely bystanders. They were casualties forced to navigate between their father and the advantages that came with their mother's royal connections. Andrew Parker Bowles accepts that some people will see his decision to speak as a bitter complaint of a man who cannot accept that his former wife found greater happiness with someone else. He understands his version of events will be questioned, that there will be those who doubt his motives and challenge his memories. But he believes truth carries its own force, and that his perspective deserves to be part of the historical record, however uncomfortable it may make certain parties. Looking back, he expresses genuine respect for what Camilla achieved in transforming herself from one of the most despised women in Britain into a respected queen consort. He recognizes the strength, intelligence, and determination that required. Yet he maintains that acknowledging her success does not require erasing the cost of her choices or ignoring collateral damage caused by her ambitions. Andrew Parker Bowles closes a leather-bound album of photographs that document a life which intersected with history in ways he never expected. His decision to speak has broken decades of carefully constructed narratives about one of the most famous love stories in royal history. Whether his account changes public perception of Queen Camilla remains to be seen. But his willingness to end 5 decades of silence means that future historians will have a more complete picture of the events that shaped the modern monarchy. Some secrets are too important to carry to the grave. The truth, however difficult, deserves to be heard.